India's big, young, dynamic working population, and more of it coming into the workforce, that's actually been a big talking point for over a decade that I know of. And I say I know of from when I was a younger journalist, and when I was young and I just joined this industry. That's when I first heard about the demographic dividend and the demographic factors. But it's equally relevant now, even now. Some of the variables, of course, have changed. And I'm not just talking about the fact that I'm not young anymore, but other variables when it comes to the young population of our country, to the economy, to the way the country is growing, what's important, where are we focusing, and all of that. Which is why it's still important to have this conversation. Now, this is a room, of course, full of experts from the industry. We have economists, we have representatives from various businesses. So I don't need to really explain to you what do we mean when we say the demographic dividend or the demographic challenges. So let's straight up dive into this conversation. You've been introduced to our two panelists, esteemed panelists who are here. Mr. Kant, I'm going to start off with you. To your mind, how are we using, and to what extent in the coming years can we use this demographic dividend?
So Tanvi, the real challenge is that if you look at the multi-poverty index, we've lifted a very vast segment of our population above the poverty line. In the last decade, close to about 300 million people have been lifted above poverty line. But the challenge really is to grow at high rates. We need to grow at rates of 8 to 9% consecutively year after year, year after year, year after year. And the best antidote to any kind of a demographic challenge is to have consistent growth over a long period of time. Now, we had the 91 reforms, but subsequent to that, there weren't many reforms. But what the post-COVID period has done is two really big things. One is that we've carried out vast structural reforms across many sectors of our economy, starting from the definition of MSME to agriculture, to coal, to mining. A whole range of reforms have been carried out. And to my mind, this was long called for, and this will really drive. We've had a very, with the strongest recovery in the post-COVID period. We've had a V-shaped recovery. But I think this will accelerate the pace of growth, not for the next year. It's not important to just look at next year, but look at the next decade and how we are able to, the compounding power of growth year after year is very critical. The second key challenge to my mind is that, we've been very successfully able to digitize a vast segment of our economy, from the JAM Trinity to the UPI, to a whole range. Look at the public finance management system in government, a whole range of areas we've digitized. And that really shows our ability to technologically leapfrog. What is very important is that we should really look at the sunshine areas of growth, really the sunrise areas of growth for the next decade. Quite often in India, we get into the sunset areas of growth. For instance, 78% of our exports are in areas where the global trade is only 25%. So you need to get into, we became a major importing area in the sunrise areas of growth. So you need to get into the sunrise areas of growth. And those are areas, whether it's 5G technology, whether it's genomics, whether it's battery manufacturing, whether it's hydrogen. These are areas which are going to give you the quantum leap forward in the years to come. So to my mind, there's no substitute to growth. There's no, if you want employment, that's growth. If you want to drive demographic dividend, it's growth. And that the government has shown its political and administrative will to drive major structural reforms which should herald you on a long-term growth path.
Fair enough. I completely agree with you. And like you said, we are on our way. We are looking at double-digit growth in the coming years, a V-shaped recovery. But let's say we go back a few years when India was growing at 8%. When India was also at that point of time the talk of the world in terms of the growth that we were registering. But Mr. Subramanian, even then, jobs creation of jobs, employment opportunities was a concern. The thought process that are we creating enough for the workforce that's entering the segment was a conversation. We've now slowed down. We've had a recession because of the pandemic. That's just made things more difficult for us. So what happens to the unemployment? Let's set the record straight. There's been so much bickering back and forth about creation of jobs and unemployment. Let's set the record straight. How big of a crisis or challenge do you think it is?
Very good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Tanvi, and the organizers for inviting me. Before I answer that question, Tanvi, let me just build on some very good points that Amitabh has made. If you look at the change in the model for economic development that India is witnessing, we can think about that as a tripod that has three important legs to it. The first leg is exclusive focus on growth together with efficient welfare, which recognizes that you need growth to generate those resources for efficient welfare. And I think this government has already demonstrated capably the ability to do efficient welfare. That's the first leg of the tripod. The other two legs are about how to bring about that growth. The second leg there is thinking about wealth creation as a boon, not a bane, thereby enabling and empowering the private sector, the socialist era being given a burial, and marrying the invisible hand of the market with the hand of ethics, ethical wealth creation. That's the second leg. And third one is about how, even more granular, how do we go about getting that growth? And that's where, the specific question that you've asked, I will elucidate on that. This is about a virtuous cycle, starts from private investment. From private investment, it basically goes on to productivity and growth, which creates jobs. And jobs puts money in the hands of people, aggregate demand increases in the economy, anticipating the increase in aggregate demand, investment goes up. That's where I think it is important to fit the conversation on employment in this tripod and in the vertex relating to the virtuous cycle. Now, here's where let's understand what's been the spirit of reforms that have been carried out. If you look at the focus there, the emphasis has been on enabling the primary and secondary sectors of the economy. Why? Because the secondary sector, which is manufacturing, is extremely critical for job creation. If you look across the world, if you take, for instance, the United States, after the Second World War, it grew by creating a large middle class. Towns like Detroit, etc., actually grew from organized manufacturing, and in fact, their decline has actually mirrored the moving away of organized manufacturing. What India needs today, therefore, is actually significant number of jobs to be created in the manufacturing sector. At the same time, also moving people away from agriculture, into manufacturing, and that is where, if you now try to see the emphasis of reforms, whether it's the PLI scheme, Amitabh has been a big champion of that, the change in the MSME definitions so that economies of scale can be availed, the phenomenon of dwarfism actually, which is, by the way, one of the most important aspects that we need to focus on. The 2018-19 survey, for instance, had shown that by the time a firm in the US becomes 30-year-old, from being 5-year-old, the firm has created 7 times as many jobs when it's 30-year-old. In India, that same firm, by the time it is 30-year-old, has created only 40% more jobs, 1.4. There you see the crux of the problem of job creation. This is not an issue to which there are basically short-term fixes. I think it is important to recognize that small firms that grow are the ones that really create a lot of formal sector jobs. And formal sector jobs are really important at the macroeconomic level to push aggregate demand. And therefore, the emphasis on reforms has been on enabling sectors that can deliver these jobs, which is your primary and secondary sectors. And I think as as the pieces of the puzzle have been put together over the last year and a half, especially in the last year, and with the budget being the crescendo of that, I think you will start seeing these effects. What you have to recognize is that the virtuous cycle always starts from investment, private investment. And as we speak, the investment climate has already started going up very well. The other effects will come, but will come with lags. And I have no doubt about that.
So I just have a follow-up on that before we talk about the larger strategy, and I go back to Mr. Kant as well. You mentioned and you emphasized repeatedly on private investment being the first step, being the kickstart. And you gave us a very interesting example, actually, about US versus India and how companies over the years can contribute to job creation. Now, the 40% number, I'm assuming, would be pre-pandemic, if we factor in the job losses or the pruning that many corporates would have done to ensure that the profits remain and your operations continue, but your costs go down.
Now, Tanvi, let's understand the evidence very clearly. This is an average 5-year-old firm growing to be a 30-year-old firm.
Okay.
So this can't be data that is interpreted, 1 year before
Over
pandemic.
Okay.
It's a long-run phenomenon that is happening. Let's not interpret it in short term. We'll make mistakes on that. The clear point that is being mentioned is that there's been a long-term problem of dwarfs in the
Correct.
economy, firms that age but do not grow and thereby do not create jobs. And that is the reforms that are being carried out are to address that central problem.
Okay, fair enough, because that was going to be my question. Firms that grow, firms that improve on books in terms of profitability, but are not adding those many jobs, could be a problem that we also need to look at, and those are the solutions that you mentioned there. So then, Mr. Kant, would it be fair to say that yes, steps, of course, are being taken, impact is being seen on ground in terms of job creations. We are also repeatedly told about how it's about investment. FDI under the current government in the last several years has been touching new highs. If you look at the PF accounts that is being opened, we know obviously those many jobs in the formal sector are being created. Will it be fair to say that we are creating 10 jobs when there are 15 people looking for a job, and that number perhaps in the last few years has gone to 20?
Tanvi, the key point is what the government is now aiming to do in terms of bringing in size and scale of manufacturing. And secondly, I think the second big challenge was to really push the levels of investments, because eventually there cannot be a policy of only job creation. There has to be a policy of growth, a consequence of which is job creation. Let's get that
Correct.
clear.
Correct.
You can't be distributing poverty. You have to distribute high levels of growth.
Absolutely.
So what firstly the government has done is, it's pushed for size and scale of manufacturing by bringing in the production-linked incentive scheme across 13 different sectors. It's allocated $26 billion US, which is one of the biggest schemes. But a consequence of the production-linked incentive, as the Prime Minister said, would be, a logical consequence is you're providing 5% to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in size for the next 5 years. If you grow bigger, we support you. If you grow bigger, we support you. And as a consequence of that, logically, what the country should get is an investment, is an increased production of 520 billion in the next 5 years. And that should really lead to job creation. That's number one point, which is very important. Second is this government's policy of asset monetization. The government is good at doing something, so government built assets, roads, highways, airports, grids, power grids, pipelines, etc. But government can be rather poor at maintenance. So government wants more and more and more assets to be created. So what it is doing is it's putting out these assets on InvITs and REITs and on TOTs for long-term basis so that the private sector comes in and starts operating. And what does the private sector do? When it comes in, it brings equity and it raises debt from the financial institutions and it runs it. And the government uses that money to create more and more of assets. So the government has created a pipeline of 111 lakh crores for national infrastructure pipeline. Now, when you had a similar situation as the COVID time in the 1920s, at the time of the Great Depression, they got rid of it through what Roosevelt called was nothing else but infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. And therefore, the whole focus is on top-class infrastructure creation, driving a huge amount of assets, monetization, so that the private sector comes in and with it brings in greater levels of efficiency, brings in investment, and once it comes in with investment, it will bring in debt. And therefore, you start this whole virtuous cycle of high level of growth, as a consequence of which you will drive job creation in the economy.
Okay, so private investment, manufacturing, creation of infrastructure, and ensuring that there is private sector participation in that. But then
Tanvi,
comes...
if I may just
yeah,
add
sure,
to,
yes.
I think the point that Amitabh has made is something that all of us have to really understand very well. You know, at the macroeconomic level, every variable, whether it's investment, growth, employment, are both cause and effect. I think this is extremely important to understand. And what we had shown in the 2018-19 survey is, by looking at countries that grew at least 5% in real terms for at least a decade, what was the trigger? The trigger was investment. And employment and growth are outcomes of that. I think that is, and here's where I just want to, add to what Amitabh is saying. See, if you think about growth as basically the investment rate in the country times the ICOR, what is called the incremental capital output ratio. Because of the public investment which crowds in private investment, your investment rate should go up. And because of asset monetization and privatization, and thereby assets moving into more productive hands, your ICOR will also improve. And that's what will drive the improvements, the growth, and which will bring jobs, together with the emphasis on the sectors. While I'm talking about growth overall, the emphasis on primary and secondary sectors are the ones there. The potential for job creation is significant. I think we have to recognize there are no short-term silver bullets. What you have is long-term, and what this thinking is displaying, the impact of that, mark my words, will come in when the virtuous cycle starts accelerating.
No, I'm completely with both of you when you talk about the big push for privatization, and that being the engine for growth that is required, and hence job creation as well. Let's talk about the other aspect. Now, you've created the environment, you've brought in the money, you've set up the factories, or you've pushed certain sectors that can be the sunrise sectors. What about skill matching? Do we have the workforce that is ready for that kind of? Of course, our government started a series of skill upgradation, skill training programs. Is there a sense that that needs to parallelly also be the big focus? Otherwise, you end up having people in the workforce, in the market, who are trained for something where jobs are not available, and the jobs that are available, nobody's trained for that.
So Tanvi, one of the big drivers of change is really the new education policy, which really pushes for skill from school level onwards. And to my mind, that's a paradigm shift. But more important than that is what the skilling, the National Skill Qualification Program has done, brought in a vast range of skilling programs and actually equipped people for today's new age generation jobs in a very big way. My only complaint is that the private sector should pay a skilled worker more than what he's getting now, and that the private sector is still not willing to pay a higher salary, which is very, very critical to my mind. And the second key challenge to my mind is, as we are digitizing in a very big way across sectors of the economy, and COVID-19 has only accelerated that pace, we've become from being just a mere data-rich country, we've become a highly data-intelligent country. And therefore, we need to create the new data scientists of tomorrow, the new artificial intelligence people of tomorrow, and you need a lot of, our IITs need to be restructured to create artificial engineers of tomorrow to really drive India on an accelerated path forward. But a lot has been done in terms of skilling, in terms of both the new education policy and the vast number of skill programs. But just that the world is changing so rapidly, and as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to understand this, that for years, we've been exporting in areas where there's just only 25% of global trade taking place. You need to get into completely new areas. Tomorrow, hydrogen will be a new area of growth. Battery production will be a new area of growth. Genomics will be a new area of growth. 5G technology will be a very major new area of growth. These are all sunrise areas of growth. And that's how we missed out on the mobile revolution. That's how we became a major importing nation of mobiles. We became a major importing nation of telecom equipments. That is what the new government is this government is equipping us for doing. Actually getting into new areas of growth, skilling you for that, and preparing you for the world of tomorrow, which will really reshape the world of the new world of trade and growth.
Mr. Kant, when you said about the private sector, unfortunately, because we're living in COVID times, everybody's wearing a mask, so I could not see the reactions of people in the audience, many of whom will be from the private sector. But I think that's a very important message for everybody. You got to pay your skilled people on par and what they deserve. Pay more, yes. And so the government's done its bit. The government has done its bit in terms of bringing in labor reforms. Even the states have changed labor codes to make it easier for the private sector to hire and to run these people. But how do you now enforce the other aspect, the point that you raise? How do you ensure that those people are also paid the right money?
So, my belief is that essentially what the private sector also will be doing with increased investment will be higher levels of productivity. I mean, if you're going to have data, if you're going to drive your company tomorrow, you need to use the data for becoming, a completely digital economy. If you look at the top 10 companies of the world, out of the top 10 companies, 8 are digital companies. If you're not a digital company today, even the manufacturing companies are all digital companies. And therefore, if you're not keeping pace with the new trends of becoming a digitized company, you're getting wiped out totally. And therefore, increasingly, you will see that each one of them, or look at this new study by Credit Suisse, 100 new unicorns in this country producing a market capitalization of 240 billion. So what it really shows is that there is a completely new era of new startups.
Correct.
There's a new era of disruption. There's a new era of digitization. And therefore, those companies will grow which get the right people to work for them and pay a higher salary for them. Otherwise, you go bust.
Tanvi, I do want to add one dimension here. What Amitabh is talking about is extremely important on the cutting edge skills. But what we also need in India is jobs for the large masses, and that's where one of the ideas that and I'm glad that the PLI scheme includes this sector is network products, and the idea of assemble in India. If you look at our automobile sector, it's a very good example, and the example of China and Japan, the way they grew to become export-intensive, growth economies, is also illustrative of this. Early on, when Maruti was producing the Maruti 800, they were basically just importing the components, assembling them here, and selling it. But over time, what happened? You had the entire ancillary sector growing, the backward and forward integration happening, where components now are manufactured here, and that is an example of actually first being able to walk first and then run, which is what has happened. If you look at Japan's, and that's something we studied very carefully in last year's economic survey as well. Japan or China or Vietnam, they start off by actually doing the assembling in particular sectors where they don't have as much presence, and then gradually expand into the entire value chain. I think that's something which India must focus on, given the the labor-intensive economy we have. And the second point, which is on skilling, I want to make a bigger point here, which is, see, that one of the remnants of the socialist era has been that we keep thinking that government has to do everything, okay? But when you think about an economy that is driven by the private sector, the role of the government is to intervene only where what we economists call there are market failures. In other words, where supply and demand do not come together. And if you take skilling is an area where supply and demand can actually come together. Market fail is not so obvious there. Because when a company invests, let's say, in skilling its people, yes, some people will go and maybe work with other, competitors, but you do have actually two things happening. The average level of skilling goes up. The fact that there are others who actually leave and work with competitors creates the incentive for others to get skilled as well, and overall skill levels go up in the economy. This is something where private sector, therefore, needs to look at just from their business proposition, not wait for the government to say, come up with a skilling program, because there is no market failure here that I foresee necessarily.
Fair enough, but that would be at a later stage. That's when you're already in the workforce. In the sense that when you're already part of the workforce, you're already part of a company, and then it's that company and the sector's responsibility to ensure your skills get upgraded. But there is I think what Mr. Kant was referring to is to start early with the right skills. We have instances of way too many engineers with not enough engineering jobs. I'm just giving it's a very basic example, but you get the point.
No, but I think there also, it's not necessary that can't be taken care of, in the same way that I'm talking about, which is, if for instance these engineers are hired as interns initially, where they actually learn on the job, they're paid a lower wage possibly, and then get the training, and then maybe not hire everybody. Among those that are good, this is also, again, there are private sector solutions that are possible to this, even in actually, in expanding the base of employees. I do not necessarily think that there is a market failure here. And I think that this prism of actually not waiting for government to do everything is the private sector counterpart of focusing on wealth creation, the invisible hand of markets that the private sector needs to start recognizing.
Okay, because we are short on time, I'm going to leave that one here and perhaps have a longer conversation off the stage. But yes, private sector needs to take the lead. Let's talk about another part, relatively smaller, Mr. Subramanian, and that's the government jobs. Now, while we've spoken about the long-term solutions, one of the short-term solutions can be to fill up the vacancies, which are across central and state departments. We've now seen a system where exams are delayed, exams are cancelled, appointments are getting delayed, schedules are all over the place. Pandemics perhaps even made it worse for justifiable reasons. But in the immediate, is there a thought process to fix that and thereby unleash an entire gamut of jobs which are available and not used?
Pardon me, Tanvi, but I think you are falling into the same trap that I talked about. Again, focusing on the government here. Think about the overall proportion of jobs that are required and filling up vacancies, just ABC analysis. What is the number you're going to get there actually by filling? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but one of the key aspects of actually big picture thinking is focus on the big ideas.
But you don't have to do anything here. The jobs exist. The jobs exist. You just need to give it to people while you lay out and implement your longer term plan.
I get that. All I'm saying is I am trying to actually change the emphasis on the big ideas, the ones that will make the biggest impact, rather than always turning around and saying, why doesn't the government do something? Agreed. And as you yourself said, the labor law reforms, all the changes in policy changes we've already done. I think it is now for the private sector to start recognizing that in their own business interest, they should train people, and when they contribute to employment, overall aggregate demand increases as well. Recognize that it's a sum of everybody that is basically the macroeconomy, and so microeconomic decisions made by particular firms is what contributes to the macroeconomy. I think this aspect also must be focused on, and I think it behooves on me to actually highlight this for the benefit of everyone.
Well, so sum and substance of this, government's larger vision and plan is to target areas where you see significant scope and growth in the next 20, 30 years. Start building towards that, but a large onus is also on the private sector. I personally believe that India is currently at a turning point with the pandemic, and the 1 year since the pandemic hit us. It is now that we need to decide how will we use the demographic dividend and not let it get converted into a disaster. And it has to be a joint government-private sector. That's what our experts here have to say. Thank you so much. Thank you for both of you for joining us.
Thank you very much.